Hello, everyone. I am Ines Katzenstein, curator of Latin American art and director of the Cisneros Institute at MoMA. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the second and final session of Espaço Preto, or Black Space, a program conceived by curator Thomas Lax to reflect on the current situation of Black cultures in Brazil. In the first session of Espaço Preto last week, artist Rosana Paulino and curator Gianni Lima discussed the implications of a recent increased visibility of Black artists and curators in the arts of Brazil. Today, we will be zooming in into that art scene, focusing on the work of a specific artist, Aline Motta, and a specific project in the public spaces of São Paulo titled Voices Against Racism, which will be presented by its curator, Hélio Menezes. These two conversations are part of Searching for Yemanja, a project proposed by Thomas Lax that was the recipient of the first research grant for MoMA and PS1 curators offered by the Cisneros Institute. I want to thank Thomas for his work as Cisneros Institute Fellow during this last year, and to our guests, Aline and Hélio, for being with us tonight. A couple of practical matters before starting. First, after the dialogue between Hélio, Aline, and Thomas, they will take questions from the audience. So please submit them via the chat feature that is below your Zoom screen, either in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. The participants will try to answer them as they can, considering the time limitations. Second, we are offering closed captioning. So if you feel you need to follow the conversation with a written complement, please click on the CC symbol also below your Zoom screen. Last but not least, at the end of this session, we will be sending you a brief survey. Please do share your responses to let us know if and how you would like to continue to be part of the conversations we began here. So without further ado, I turn it over to Thomas, and I thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inez Katzenstein, for the warm introduction, and to Maria del Carmen Carrion, the Cisneros Institute project manager, who worked collaboratively to envision tonight's program. Thank you also to Patty Cisneros for this opportunity, to Lilia Toboada, curatorial fellow, and Madeline Turner, CMAP Latin American fellow, who assisted in invaluable ways. Thanks also to our colleagues, Jeffrey Ensel, Hunter Webb, and Michelle, who are making tonight's audio, visuals, and caption possible. Welcome and boa noite. Thank you for being with us this evening. I am Thomas Lax, a curator at MoMA, where I focus on creating spaces for Black artists and various publics to freely experiment. As Inez mentioned, at the beginning of 2020, I traveled to Salvador de Bahia, to Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo as a Cisneros Research Fellow, where I met with artists and culture bearers. When I got back, the moment that was ushered in by the coronavirus pandemic asked us to find novel ways to assemble with one another. I began working with Inez and Maria del Carmen to organize two conversations, together titled Espaço Preto, or Black Space. These conversations, each organized between an artist and a curator, were designed to highlight the relationships that have changed the terms of Brazil's most powerful museums and universities. These collaborations, among others, have created spaces of self-determination to connect the past and the present to the future of our own making, as well as to transform spaces historically dominated by whiteness. Last week, as Inez mentioned, artist Rosana Paulino and curator Gianni Lima participated in the first part of this conversation, titled How to Write a Feminist History of the Recent Past. Together, they offered a panorama and a set of personal impressions on the changes afoot in Brazil. The recorded conversation, along with this one, will be posted online later this month. Today, we have the opportunity to continue the conversation about Black space and hear from two influential figures, artist Aline Motta and curator Hélio Menezes. Tonight's conversation occurs against the backdrop of ongoing crises. Not a day, an hour, a week goes by without our own health, the health of a loved one, or the safety of our communities rendered increasingly precarious. In the face of the anxiety and dread this reality creates, we ask, what else is possible? The title of tonight's conversation, Other Foundations, suggests that other pasts already exist that make different futures not only imaginable, but also here and now. The title is borrowed from Aline Motta's work, a series of photographs and a video made during a journey across locations including Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Portugal, and Brazil's Cachoeira, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais. This journey and the different roles she took up as a self-taught musicologist, historian, and narrator asks what other foundations we might find in the connections between West and Central Africa and South America across the Southern Atlantic. Next slide, please. You will find Aline Motta's short biography and a link to her website in the chat. But I wanted to pause on this gorgeous image from her exhibition, Memory, Journey, and Water, currently on view after a delay at the MAR, the Rio Art Museum, to wish her a warm congratulations on its recent success. Please join me in welcoming Aline Motta.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, Aline. Next slide, please. Aline's work has been included in numerous solo exhibitions as well as group exhibitions, perhaps most importantly, those organized by curator Hélio Menezes, who is here with us tonight. Hélio co-curated the important exhibition Afro-Atlantic Histories at Mashpi and Instituto Tomi Otaki in 2018. Afro-Atlantic Histories was a game changer, described by Holland Cotter from the New York Times as greatly enthralling. In 2020, Hélio curated the discovery of what it means to be Brazilian in Chicago. I met Hélio just after he returned from his Chicago exhibition, which you guys see here. He invited me to an opening, and I quickly saw how the magnetism used to describe the exhibitions that he had organized also applied to his person, as I saw artist after artist, friend after friend greet him. As you will see in the short bio for Hélio in the chat, he is many things. The curator of contemporary art at the wonderful Centro Cultural in São Paulo, a scholar who has importantly historicized the use of the term Afro-Brazilian art, one of the organizers of the recent project Voices Against Racism, which we'll have a chance to hear him discuss tonight, and a supporter of artists who, through his projects, have contributed to the excavation of other foundations. Please join me in welcoming Hélio Menezes.
Hi, Thomas. Hi, Aline. Nice to see you all. Thank you for having me tonight.
It's wonderful to see you, Hélio, equally. And with this beautiful image, I wanted to pass the mic to you to hear more about this gorgeous show and the social space in which you allowed and created for the folks who came into it.
Thank you, Thomas, so much for this invitation. I would like to thank you and Aline personally, and also MoMA and the Cisneros Institute for this opportunity to be here, and to our viewers tonight for their time and attention. So it's a joy and an honor to be here with all of you tonight. I think that the title of our conversation comes in a form of a question, other foundations. So I will start this talk invoking another yet perfectly complementary question taken from the banner by anti-racist collective from São Paulo, Frente 3 de Fevereiro, which I invited to intervene on the facades of both institutions hosting Afro-Atlantic Histories 2 years ago. If you can help me passing to the other slides, please. This is another scene of the discovery of what it means to be Brazilian in Chicago, Mariana Ibrahim Gallery, but the other one, please. The other slide. And also this is a view from the installation called New Republic. These are all some projects, recent projects I curated, organized in different parts. But I'd like to get to the another slide, the next one, maybe next two ones. Luciane Ramos, and now this one. Thank you very much. So when I was saying about that collective called Frente 3 de Fevereiro, and they intervened on the facades of Instituto Tomi Otaki on the right side and at MASP at the other side. So the banner provoked direct confrontation with the institutions themselves and their surroundings, since both are located in upper class and mostly white neighborhoods in São Paulo. Where are the blacks? Where are the black artists in Brazilian art history? Where are the blacks in the hierarchies and power positions of cultural institutions in Brazil? And what about black curators, researchers, producers? Which positions do they occupy? So I think that Afro-Atlantic Histories, as Thomas was just saying, it was curated by 5 professionals, 3 white curators from MASP's staff, Adriana Pedrosa, Lilia Schwartz, and Tomás Toledo, and 2 invited Afro-Brazilian curators, my colleague Ailson Heráclito and I. So given these intrinsic inequalities, you can imagine the complex debates and the struggles within the curatorial decisions and processes. So in this context, I want to ask today, what is the actual problem here? What are institutions and people in positions of power still holding on to or holding back for in their efforts to implement structural changes? Which foundations do we still need to question and to rebuild on other bases? Not coincidentally, next slide, please. This article from the New York Times featured this powerful and atemporal self-portrait of Sidney Amaral called Necklace, Who Shall Speak on Our Behalf. It was displayed in the newspaper side by side with Exu's Ship by José Alves de Olinda, a popular artist from the northeast region of Brazil, the bronze sculpture Amnesia by Flávio Cerqueira, which depicts a black boy pouring white paint over his body, and this stunning portrait of Zeferina, a Maroon leader from 19th century whose face is unknown, but was fabulated by Dalton Paula, a great artist and friend who has just recently had 3 of his works donated to MoMA's collection. So Amaral's Necklace, in the next slide, is a good example of a practice widely shared among some important contemporary Black and Indigenous artists. The next slide, please. The use of one's own body or that of family members as a support or theme, as well as systematically taking images of Brazil's unresolved past as a reference for their work in order to subvert and resignify their understanding in the present. A movement that starts from the personal and subjective to reach the social and collective with no borders between these 2 spaces. I think that the critical revision of Officio's Brazil history and Brazilian art history by those artists contesting the imaginary and social stereotypes that surround us require other visions, let's say, for exhibiting and working with these artistic proposals, ultimately challenging traditional curatorial practices. In the next slide, we'll see a good example of that, because refounding, let's say, artistic and curatorial practices among the African diaspora is not new. In the 50s, for example, Abdias Nascimento was already innovating in a series of strategies, projects, and productions. One good example is his efforts to create the first Black Arts Museum in Brazil from 1955 onwards, gathering an important collection, even though he never got support for a physical space for it. In his artistic research and production, he also refounded, let's say, techniques and themes by depicting his own views and roots, placing ancestral and Afro-Brazilian religious symbols at the center of his works. Okeoshossi, that piece in the right side, which had never been displayed in Brazil before, let's say, is an example of his intense artistic production during his exile in the United States from Brazil's military dictatorship in the 60s and 70s. During that time, Abdias had contact with the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, African-American artists, and other intellectual figures. In the series of work which Okeoshossi belongs to, it is clear how he has visually translated concepts like quilombismo, coined by intellectual Beatriz Nascimento, and adopts his own other foundations to express worldviews and political sentiments. Hence, this emblematic version of the Brazilian flag is refounded on Afro-Atlantic roots and reinvents the sense of nationality by picturing the flag vertically and replacing the positivist European slogan order and progress with the Yoruba word oke, a greeting used to salute Orisha Oshosi, the deity of hunting and abundance, represented by the bow and arrow. In the next slide, you see another view of the same exhibition, because all of this discussion leads us back to Aline's work, who reflects her origins and ancestors as an unlimited source for her artistic practice, and has developed a robust and long-term research on family, Atlantic trafficking, photography, and relations between Africa and Brazil. In this picture, we see Aline Motta's work, Bridges Over the Abyss, alongside Walter Firmo's photograph called Petrópolis, Flávio Gomes' photograph called Uncle Marco, Quilombo leader of Itamori, Seydou Keita's imponent portrait, and other photographers, all of them dealing with Black family issues. As we know, portrait collections from museums typically display images of royals, government, and religious leaders or members of the local elite. These are almost all portraits of white people, usually white men. Representations of Black men and women are rare, and family portraits even rarer. Let's go deep on Aline's work, this one specifically which connected us and bonded us for life. Because the next slide, you're gonna see it in more details. Aline Motta inverts this tradition of whiteness. In this work specifically, Aline uses a series of strategies in order to build a possible family genealogy. As you can see, the photograph shows the chief Imam Mustafa Kolker of the Mende ethnic group sitting in posture and elegant attire, while holding proudly a framed photo of his mother in front of another photo, the artist's great-grandmother, enlarged and printed in fabric. The first time Aline showed me this picture of her great-grandmother and told me all the story that I'm sure she's gonna tell us again in a few minutes, I was just convinced that this face reunited some of Brazilian main important issues in its historical, social, economical history. There's everything there. We can see the face of Brazil and the face of the Afro-Atlantic history in her great-grandmother picture. I was then convinced that that face should be seen by more people. More and more people should see her face and know her story in order to identify themselves and also to think about the other foundations of Brazil. In the middle, but in the left corner, in fact, 3 children watch the scene in the background. In the photo of the imam's mother, it can be read in English: "May your soul rest in perfect peace, my dear mother." By uniting the imam, his mother, and as well her great-grandmother, Aline Motta reinvented the kinship lies that slavery tried to tie up. I'm really very proud and happy to be here with Aline, and I would love to hear more and ask her to also talk about this so important piece to our viewers tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Hélio. That was so nice. I really feel welcomed in this space. And I want to welcome everyone, especially Brazilians. there are in this virtual room, at least tonight, we can feel that we belong. I want to first talk a little bit about Thomas' visit, and then I will go and talk more about this picture. But you know, Thomas, when you came into my studio in São Paulo, I could see that your heart was full of love. I could see your generosity, your humility, and respect for our culture. It is not always the case. So many foreigners, scholars, curators have been coming to Brazil for research, but all they do is strip us of our knowledge because they have better funding, more support, better connections for the research that we Brazilians would like to do ourselves. But this one feels exceptional. This one feels like a true collaboration. And this discussion is proof of your work ethic. You know, Thomas, being receptive is revolutionary. Doing this presentation in English is not easy. Some people fail to realize that English is not my mother tongue. And when we come to think of it, not even Portuguese is our mother tongue, as it was forced upon us. So our role as artists is to keep subverting the very language that tried to silence us at every turn. I can feel a bit of tension in the air, the weight upon my shoulders, but I embrace this tension. I embrace my shyness. In a situation like this, having fear is not about lack of confidence. It is sheer power imbalance. So, as Hélio was saying, so much of my work is about my own family, especially about my grandmother. Grandmothers are the healing forces within our community. If it weren't for my grandmother, I wouldn't be here today. The centrality of her existence in my life shapes everything I do. So I honor her, I worship her, I invoke her presence tonight. Also, as you can see in this picture, my work is so much about construction and the use of archival material. So I really like Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation and how a critical look can also frame creation into an unexpected result. New lines of descent, filiation, and kinship can be imagined. We might be fragmented, but we are not broken. Much has been lost in translation, but I can still pick up the pieces and form a whole. I can seize hold of language and build my own, word by word, frame by frame, a shared diasporic language. I also like the idea to invent from an inventory, which I draw from Brazilian musician and scholar Tigana Santana. I feel that each frame of my videos contains all the other frames. Each frame contains all the temporalities, the past, a presentification of the past, and a somewhat dystopian future. I say dystopian future because it is not guaranteed that it will happen. It is unstable, impermeable. When I started looking deeper into Central African cosmologies, Bantu, so to speak, cosmologies, Congo, Angola cosmologies, I got some really deep insights about the foundations of my work. I'd like to share them with you tonight. I think this can resonate to some of you. There are two fundamental concepts in these Central African cosmologies. One is the worshipping of the ancestors. The idea that they need to be constantly remembered, honored, worshipped, fed. Second is a deep connection to nature, life cycles connected to the cycles of nature. The idea that the duration of one single day is connected to the cycle of life and death of all beings. So, you are born at 6 a.m., you become an adult at noon, you turn old at 6 p.m., and you become an ancestor at midnight. And the cycle repeats itself every day as a circle. And what separates the dimensions of the living and of the dead is a fine line of water called Kalunga. So I can say my work is all about grandmothers and all about water. By this way of seeing the world, water holds memory. Water is seen as a vehicle. Water is a time machine. Hopefully, there are some African Americans in the room. So now, I would like to call your attention to the African American spiritual wade in the water. I can see spirituals as a riddle, as a knot to be untied, an enigma to be solved, a truth to be revealed. Much alike our Afro-Brazilian jongo. So the lyrics of Wade in the Water, it says, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. I'm not sure what the verb to wade exactly means, but what I do know is that it is very connected to this Central African cosmology I was talking about. To wade is not to immerse yourself or to jump into the water, but to go in between two worlds, two dimensions. A dimension we can see, a dimension we cannot see, a dimension we can touch, a dimension we cannot touch. When you're wading in the water, you're not walking, you're navigating. So when I wade in the water, God, actually Nzambi, this almighty presence, will trouble the water. Waters of despair, waters of terror, waters of grief. It is an initiation. Now, I want to make a connection between the umbigada and my work. Umbigada is a dance move that can be seen in so many Afro-Brazilian dances and cultural manifestations. I project my navel forward and invite someone to join me in the center of the circle. Much alike the African American ring shout, I go around the circle counterclockwise, simulating the perception I have of the sun movement, going from east to west. I turn, I spin countless times, countless days. It is repetition. When I project my body into the center of the circle, I reach the intersection of a horizontal line, which is the Kalunga, water, and a vertical line, which represents my backbone, my spine, my foundations. I'm at the crossroad. I can then draw the spiritual signatures of my ancestors so they can guide me. It is call and response. So when I reach the center, I can navel bump time. I can navel bump my ancestors. I can navel bump myself. And then finally, I can fly away and be free. This is all for now.
Aline, this is so gorgeous, this offering you've shared with us, and this duality of the circle of the Hoda, which is on the one hand, as you began, the asymmetries that make it so difficult to find a point of connection across geopolitical difference because of the reality of power differential. And on the other hand, the aspiration against the odds of this attempt to find one another. So I really appreciate both your contribution and Hélio, your offering. How gorgeous, both of you. Thank you. This image that you brought us to of the ring shout immediately brought to mind Rashida Bumbre's recent talk she did on Instagram, which we had a chance to connect about. And you know, as you were describing the cosmogram and these various forms of diagramming, forms of influence, which, you know, the circle and the Umbigada offer some examples of within Black performance culture. You know, I was brought back to this amazing photo that Rashida showed. Rashida, for folks who don't know who she is, she's an artist and the director of Art and Culture at the Open Society Foundations here in New York. And in this recent lecture, she was showing this image of the sax player, John Lee Hooker, and the kind of emergence of the blues. And as somebody who works at MoMA, looking for other foundations, it's hard not to see this in relationship to MoMA's founding director, Alfred Barr's Cubism and abstract art, which is so famous. But by seeing this other model of arriving at the present that Rashida pointed us to, demonstrates the way that there are already all of these other ways of thinking through how the past appears in the present. And I wanted to kind of use your prompt to think in the real space of performance, the kind of public square, you know, the kind of coming together, to kind of think through one of your recent collaborations, Aline and Hélio, which is Voices Against Racism. Maybe we can go to the next slide to take a look at how, Aline, your work appeared in this project across São Paulo that Hélio co-organized, that included videos, photography, graffiti, installation. And in our earlier conversations, you mentioned, Hélio, that, you know, part of your thinking here was not just about how art is produced, but how art is received. What is the context in which the ideas that animate the kinds of transfers of knowledge, Aline, you're describing in the navel bump, appear in public space, in architecture, and in monuments?
Definitely, yes, because I mean, this is the main point, I guess, on a curatorial perspective of what Aline has just said. because all this investigation, all those artists are dealing with subjects and other foundations, to repeat the theme of this night, which are not well visualized by some of traditional curatorial practices. So it's really necessary to think other ways of exhibiting it, working with those artists. And I do think that here you can see Aline's work, other foundations, exactly who lent ours even tonight, name, projected over a public youth center in Paraisópolis, one of the largest favelas communities in São Paulo's outskirts. The main idea was to see all those amazing works. We organized around 40 places, 30 works of Black and Indigenous contemporary artists, over 40 open public spaces around São Paulo between July and August this year. So the main idea was that, like, to put these photographs, graphics, films, installations, etc., connected to the city, connected to the buildings, historical buildings, monuments, some of controversial monuments and buildings as well. But the main idea was like people would not go inside the museum, inside the gallery to see art. They would just see it like walking in the street. So the main idea, of course, was to think on the security, because we are now in Brazil, living a very difficult moment as a sanitary problem, because Brazil is the second country in deaths in the world of coronavirus, and with a fascist government in power. So the whole constraint against cultural institutions and artists is now getting in Brazil maybe one of its most difficult times. So the main idea of this project was, let's see these other foundations, let's see those artists that are really taking back complicated images, complicated issues of our past and present, and reimagine it for the future. So this is a good example here. There is a map, just this map is like showing these 40 different places in São Paulo, and our attempt was to locate most of the artworks in São Paulo's outskirts and not in downtown São Paulo. So even me, I wasn't able to see all the installations because it was like happening in so many different places, and the negotiation with each place was a specific drama. So you can imagine, like, we need to go to each school, to each monument, to talk with the government, with the police, whatever, with many people, different scales, in order to have images like this. Or if you can go to the next slide. Also, yep, this one, for example, which, because, I mean, just to take back what you were just discussing in the beginning of this talk, because contemporary Afro-Brazilian and native indigenous Brazilian arts have never been so strong and flourishing as it is now, just when Brazil is experiencing a period of explicitly authoritarian politics that has fueled environmental destruction, economic retraction, increasing violations of fundamental rights, especially against indigenous, Black, peasants, poor people. So showing, exposing these strong works was also a way of giving a response to all that social situation we are living now. So in partnership with Coletivo Coletores, which is a group of artists focused on video mapping and projections in urban spaces, the exhibition also projected real, but also imagined, fabulated portraits of diverse Black personalities, especially women, like this 18th century Maroon Quilombola leader, Teresa de Benguela, over Igreja do Rosário dos Homens Pretos, da Penha, which could be translated as Penha's Church of the Black Men Rosary, something like this. Or if you go to the next slide, also the portrait of Carolina Maria de Jesus, the famed author of Child of the Dark, whose writings come from the Canindé favela, and criticized the false ideas of modernity reflected on the buildings of São Paulo downtown. Her portrait in this picture, as you can see, was projected at Ramos de Azevedo Square, just in front of the municipal theater, which was an emblematic site for the emergency of the unified Black movement in the late 70s in Brazil. So a bit of this idea was showing those faces and trying to discover again, which were the foundations that really built up those buildings and those monuments, literally speaking. So the proposal, if you go to the next slide, please. The proposal was precisely to visualize the dispute of and to visualize this dispute of narratives about historical buildings, monuments, public spaces in São Paulo, seeking to reveal the foundations that sustain the construction and dynamics of the city. So with this perspective, I invited the great artist Denilson Baniwa to intervene on the Monumento às Bandeiras, which is one of São Paulo's greatest symbols and postcards. As you can see, an artist from the Amazonia region and from the native group Baniwa working against this massive and clearly racist monument is a strong act in itself. But Denilson's response took it further than I could ever imagine. His 5-minute video called Brasil Terra Indígena, Brazil Indigenous Land, begins with a Portuguese caravel destroyed by forces of nature, and from the wreckage appear powerful plants, spiritual beings, primordial animals, and also other indigenous ancestral forms in those luminous neon, just like a psychedelic trip, sprouting from the granite of the monument that served only as a support for this divination of a world before colonialism. It was also a way to unveil, let's say, those other foundations for Brazil's historic narrative. So I strongly believe, Thomas, to answer your question, that the recontextualization, let's say, or even the removal of these statues, monuments, and buildings, if they do not change the past, as Aline has just said, I think that it's a fundamental step for new imaginations to flourish in the future. So their displacement, I would say, or their reconfiguration says a lot about what can no longer be tolerated in our society, what can no longer be tolerated if we do want to build up a plural common space capable of embracing diverse memories and to repair the peoples, cultures, histories, foundations that have been crushed under the weight of this white man made of stone. So I think the main idea of that exhibition was to show it, to show how strong the contemporary art in Brazil is, especially because it's been completely changed by the strategies, the very sensitive research and practice of those great artists.
Thank you so much, Hélio, for sharing and bringing this incredible project into fruition. And congratulations, I know you're just on the heels of it. So it feels like there's still room to celebrate and
you can see I'm still very excited about it. You have just like ended the exhibition.
Your excitement is contagious, Hélio. I wanted to maybe go to the next slide as a way of continuing the kind of transnational conversation that Aline prompted us to think through, and that I love, Elio, your beginning around other foundations. Like, in what ways do we have to live with the terrors of the past, even as we acknowledge that there are other memories that exist alongside of them? And these two examples from other places in the world that happened relatively recently, much like Voices Against Racism, felt like one way to kind of think through this sense of simultaneity. On the left, we see an image of the statue of Robert Milligan, who planned and built the West India docks that had the monopoly over the West Indian, produce in England, recently removed after the Museum of London Docklands asked for it to be removed. So a moment of a museum kind of stepping in and trying to make this claim. And on the right, we see Dustin Klein's projections that are, happened this summer over the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia. A highly contested site that in many ways, signaled several years ago when there was a massive protest here to keep this statue of Lee up, the beginning of the contestation that in the US is currently having around public monuments. And just today, as Inez and I were texting about earlier, Elizabeth Alexander, the poet who's the director of the Mellon Foundation, announced that there would be a $250 million project over the next 5 years for the US to reimagine its relationship to monuments and memorials. And I think there that feels really important is that she's seen storytelling, places of storytelling, be included in monuments and memorials, which rhymes so nicely with Aline, the kind of way that you've been able to, as you called it, critical fabulation, borrowing from Saidiya Hartman, kind of take on a lack of monuments to be able to look at other sites and repositories for coming together and for honoring a certain version of history. So maybe we can kind of come all together and use this, this loop of different institutions to maybe just think about what moment we are living in. This moment where, the work that you two have been up to for the entirety of your careers has now become the conversation that every institution is engaging in, and both museums and also, governments, whether they're engaging in it by refusing to engage or by engaging it through a fascistic process, as you named, is happening under Bolsonaro, and here also under the fascist presidency that we are living in under Trump. Just to think about, the irony or the intensity of the time that we're living in, that Elio, you pointed us to so directly. How is it that there's this proliferation in the same moment of fascistic control, and what are some of the ways in which, as an artist or as a person in an institution, you would like to step into that conversation or refuse the conversation?
Well, Aline, would you like to start? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but I want to point out something that really bothers me, that every time we try to have a conversation about race in Brazil, people talk about miscegenation, syncretism, hybrid forms, and then this old idea about racial democracy keeps coming back because they say, oh, Brazil, we're all mixed. Nobody's white. But then when we see who is in power, everybody's white. So what happens? So these words, every time I hear miscegenation, I really get in shock because I can't stand this word anymore. They feel used up. And because when people, they say this, they wanna ease our racial tensions. They wanna, get the conversation to be something that is gonna be good for them, but not exactly for us. as Black people. You know, they try to change the subject, but it's been too long, and we don't want to discuss under such terms anymore. I really wanted to add that.
Yeah, if I can add something, Aline, to what you have just said, because something that I think is quite an irony as well of our moment, because at the same time that we can see Black and Indigenous intellectuals, artists, curators going to seek and seeking for different resources, getting to different foundations, and going to discover other routes that not necessarily come across from Europe or the US or the Western civilization, let's say like this. Um, at the same time, the violence that we are living now kind of forces Black intellectuals, indigenous artists, to back again discuss and sometimes I think it's an eternal mission to discuss racism, to discuss inequalities, and of course it's a very important issue, but in an artistic point of view, it's something that really bothers me, that at the same time that institutions or in some specific spaces, we are getting more openness to these more political works and more social based thoughts. There is no space or just a very few space for Black abstraction, for example. There is just a few space for indigenous Black people, poor people in general, to address, for example, sentimental issues, to talk about love or to talk about other imaginations. So at the same time that we are living this flourishment of Black and indigenous and poor people arts in general, addressing very important political, aesthetical, ethical issues, it bothers me. It makes me to think a bit of, aren't we maybe reproducing part of the themes or part of the authorized themes that we are supposed to talk about. So I think there is always this 2 points, we need to see this political moment and artistic moment in Brazil in a very delicate way, because it seems to be an advance in some points, although even though we are living in fascist period, but we need also and always to question, aren't we reproducing a kind of discourse expected, authorized, when we will finally have this space to Black abstraction, for example.
Yeah.
Thank you for threading that needle so carefully, Hélio. Because in a way, yeah, there's what I'm hearing you saying is, one can't use the ground set by the dominant discourse as the only frame to understand the terms in which creativity and imagination occur, which feels very related to a question that Anna Parisi is asking in the chat around how Brazilian curators, institutions, and artists can overcome the current refusal of the Brazilian government to empower the cultural sector and Afro-Brazilian artistic production. And what I'm hearing here, and maybe this is linking with the next question by Jose Bento Ferreira, around what the role is of your work received abroad. So in what ways has the shift of, from the early part of the millennium, where the cultural minister and Department of Culture was supporting Black and Indigenous culture, to this moment, and what is the, to perhaps more than now, I guess, what is the relationship? Well, let me not put too many things together. How is your work received abroad, and in what ways would you like that reception to further the kinds of discourses that you're naming right now?
Should I start?
Yeah,
Yep.
about the curatorial ways that
Yeah.
you're
Well,
working.
I personally think that when you are a Black creator in Brazil, or indigenous creator, or someone that doesn't come from the upper classes, the moment now is not very different of what it was 10 years ago. I mean, it's still a very classist, racist, homophobic space of institutionalized arts in Brazil. Our museums, the main museums, the main events, biennials, etc., they are all ruled by white men, and most of them European white men that are in front of our main and biggest cultural and arts institution. So I personally don't think that for us, the moment now is harder than it has been the last years. But the moment now, by irony, is also the moment when many of us has finally got inside the university. It's the moment when the first of our families concluded from graduation studies, graduate studies, and postgraduate studies, and also get starting the curatorial processes and being able to do it. So I do think that the way we are doing, or at least the way I am trying to do, is like getting more and more connected to the artists, and more having this trying to find really strategies that doesn't go through the government support, but goes around it. Because it's always, we're talking about public budget. So it's our right. So I do think that there is the two ways, let's say it, and or at least the two ways that I've been working with. It's pressuring the government and private institutions publicly. So it's not fair, it's not right that only the government or nationalist projects are approved. So it must go publicly, but also trying to construct institutions out of the official institutions, because there are, just to use the word that names this event, there are many Black spaces in Brazil not institutionalized. And these are places of art and culture. What about making exhibitions at the street? What about organizing exhibitions at the terreiros of our Candomblé and Umbanda religions? What about organizing events or even exhibitions, shows, talks in our cultural Black spaces, in our peripheries, in our bars, in our restaurants? So there are many other places and people that are just very excited to make it out of the government umbrella. And I think that's the future.
Yeah,
What do you think, Eleni, about the second the second question? Because it's much more related to your work. I do think so.
I think there is some interest now. This talk is a reflection of that interest, but at least for me, it's very incipient. It's just starting. I don't see myself uh, like having a career abroad or showing my work abroad, like broadly, like in different places. Starting. It's very, very slow, but it is starting. At least it feels like there's this push forward, this interest in my work now. But it's recent. It's very, very recent.
Can I ask, in terms of your aspirations for what a reception of your work might look like or offer that's different from what's possible in Brazil? And I think this is something I heard from Hosanna last week, was that, in her having her first major exhibition in Portugal, that there was a possibility for a kind of frame elsewhere that couldn't happen within Brazil. Are there ways in which your work, Aline, has been described or picked up, or the I mean, it seems like because the semiotics of it are so entangled with other places in the world that there are specific ways in which the boundary of Afro-Brazilian or Black Brazil circumscribe it in ways that don't necessarily name all of the way that it is aspiring to exist in the world.
I think the work in itself is searching very deeply for shared dialogue, for a shared diasporic language. It really aspires to that, and that's why I think I made these connections to, you know, to the ring shout and to the spiritual wade in the water, because it wants to connect, and it wants to connect deeply, because I think people could really it's the kind of work that at least aspires to be healing in some way. There is an aspect of it that's of healing, of, you know, reaching, of, you know, being recognized. I think we were talking about that, and I was asking myself this question, which is, why do I make art? You know, I think every artist asks that at some point, because when I look outside, you know, I don't see much support from, you know, from the Brazilian government or public policy towards arts. So I ask myself, why do I make art? And I feel it's because I want to be seen. I want to be understood. And at some point, I want to be loved. So that's how deep that connection wants to reach, you know, the audience, somebody else, the public, African Americans, Afro Caribbeans, and people all across the diaspora, and obviously the African continent.
Aline, can I just like add something or ask you, in fact, because I do remember earlier this February this year, when we were at Chicago and your work was exhibited there, the American public that went there to see it felt very emotional and very touched by your work, like people crying in front of your video and pictures and identifying themselves with what was being pictured there, even though your work doesn't pass through the US. So if you could talk a little bit about that sensation, because it really touched me when we organized that exhibition there. Of course, I was expecting like a kind of identification between part of American audience and Brazilian, but I do think that your example is a good one.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because both of us, me and Hélio, we look kind of white compared to Africans. Sorry to generalize, but it is not a coincidence that we're the ones who are talking today, and that we're we're light skinned. But nobody in Brazil uh, consider us white, but we're perceived some places as not being Black. So there is this conflict, this contradiction that is, you know, in the work itself. And people, you know, in the diaspora, they connect to that exact contradiction. You know, why do we look whiter now? What happened? You know, so I think it's maybe an answer to it.
Definitely.
I can see what you're saying in that statement, Aline. And I think there's a way in which in Salvador in particular as a city, the way that Blackness is both coded in terms of the body, but coded in so many ways that are about interpersonal dynamics, about space, about how one moves with other people, felt very similar to the way in which Blackness operates as a social fact in the US. And I think it relates very clearly to the idea of Blackness in terms of abstraction that Hélio was speaking to before, and which a couple of people have asked about in the chat. And it also speaks to the question of Blackness and conceptualism that I see Julia Bryan Wilson has asked about in the chat, who is teaching your work, Aline, in her class on global conceptualisms. And in this riff, I think what I'm thinking about, there's a question from excuse me, Abigail Lapin, who asked about the exclusion of Ruben Valentin from Sur Moderno. And I think maybe as the person who works at MoMA, I can speak to that question, which is to say, and Abigail, who was a fellow at MoMA a few years ago before finishing her PhD. Hi, Abigail, good to see you here. I think it's a great question to ask because I think it speaks to the limited ways in which some of these categories capture or are able to fully elaborate upon and support the art that they define, so that, thinking about this question of abstraction or conceptualism or Blackness even as ones that are perhaps, and Ruben Valentin, for those who don't know, deeply important artistic figure from Salvador, who, working in abstraction, was able to take various kinds of Afro-Brazilian cultural and religious signifiers and bring them into his multicolored, vibrant wood constructions. Somebody who's represented in MoMA's collection. I think, in what ways does the category of Blackness as currently defined by MoMA, or abstraction currently defined by MoMA, even before we get to Latin America, right? Like even before that category enters, not account for a practice like Ruben Valentin. So the problem is not a problem specific to the Cisneros collection. The Cisneros collection actually makes it available for us to think aloud. I think the problem is a larger problem of the Museum of Modern Art and the way it defines questions of abstraction and it defines questions of Blackness. And one thing that's really inspiring is that in talking to both of you, there's a set of shared references. There's enough terms that we have in common to fight and to love on. And that feels like the work to be doing. That's what's named in the kind of Afrofuturist space that Hélio, you were speaking to earlier, and the kind of cosmovisions that Aline, you were talking to. So I wanted to kind of speak to that question. And maybe, as a way of kind of wrapping things up, ask about your own, your own senses of the immediate future, your own kind of, what is next for you two in terms of desires for connection, spaces to be working inside of. I think this was pitched as a moment to shift some of the, curatorial choices and modes of, making space within the location that we find ourselves. And I'm just curious to know, where you are, how we can support you as friends from here. And yeah, what's on your mind for what happens tomorrow?
Well, I'm currently working, in fact, for the reopening of São Paulo Cultural Center, Centro Cultural São Paulo. And we are very excited because this year is the 30th anniversary of a public policy of exhibitions. It's the first time in history of Centro Cultural São Paulo that the majority of art is selected by a very good and a very special committee this year is composed by Black and indigenous artists all over Brazil. So it's the first time that that institution recognized that the quality of those works are very, very strong and so deeply rooted that, of course, they are the face, they're the new face of Brazilian contemporary art. We have just realized that I said Brazilian and no Afro-Brazilian or indigenous contemporary art, but only Brazilian contemporary art. So this is important to say. A second project I'm working for this year is a very controversial, let's say, because it's an exhibition that I am organizing at Museu de Arte Osório César, which is in fact a place of an old psychiatric hospital where many important artists and people developed amazing works that are not very known in Brazil. And when I got to know it, I was just like exhausted. My heart was completely taken by those amazing artists. Most of them, we only know the first name, Cidinha, Ubirajara, but some of them, which are very, very special artists, we cannot, I can assure you, this museum, which is just opening after so many years, it was closed. Its first reopening exhibition. It holds more 8,000 pieces in its collection. And it's just like one cannot tell Brazilian or Latin American art history without that specific episode in our country. So it's a very hard exhibition to organize because every time you get with those pieces, you feel that part of your body is like taken out of you because those people were tortured, especially during dictatorship periods. And even under this constant torture, they created so elegant and beautiful and meaningful pieces of art. So this is exactly what I'm working right now for the end of this year, because for me it's very important, you know, to organize this kind of shows out of the traditional and most seen spaces of art in Brazil. Those spaces, unfortunately, are not now the best places for good arts and good contemporary arts, but maybe other non-expected places can show us kind of big surprises. I think it's the first project, one of the few projects I organized that Aline Motta is not participating, as you can see. We've been working together in very many different projects, but not this one, Aline.
So to wrap things up, all I have to say, you know, about the future is that, you know, that I keep working, that I keep getting funding for my work. But basically, I just, you know, expect to wake up tomorrow and go around the circle and go around the circle and go around the circle. And this is it.
Inshallah. Thank you for this reminder. I want to thank everybody who was able to tune in tonight and remind you that there'll be a chance to provide your feedback in a survey afterwards. I know there's been already a robust conversation to develop a future programs and find the best way to continue this conversation. I think before we get to tomorrow, inshallah, I just want to say thank you both for your incredible generosity with me as a fellow traveler and a newish friend. I greatly appreciate the warmth that you've had and you've shown me, both of you, and to all of our audiences and to the Museum of Modern Art for sharing your projects, your visions of the world, and the aspirations for what the future might hold. So thank you both.
Thank you. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Thomas. I just would like to invite you in front of everybody to come back, as you promised me, next year when we are opening a big exhibition on Carolina Maria de Jesus at Instituto Moreira Salles. And this is an important author in the US as well. And I would love to see you all here knowing more about this so important figure for all of us. So thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Aline. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us and staying with us tonight. I'm very thankful as well to Inez and Maria del Carmen for all the helpful and so kind generosity that you gave us. Thank you.